The performance of her life. In the light of day, Detective Michael Grimaldi did not seem quite as intimidating as he had the night before, nor did he appear quite so professorial. He almost looked handsome. Unfortunately, this shift in countenance did little to ease the tension building in Celine's body. She adjusted her seat on the creaky wooden chair positioned before the Mother Superior's desk. Then she smoothed the overskirt on the drabbest dress she owned, the color of dirty dish-water. This particular gown had been relegated to the times Celine had fiddled with fabric dyes in the atelier. Her ears still burned from how Detective Grimaldi had coolly rebuked her for using feminine wiles to sway him to her side. Today, her attire had been chosen to make the point that Celine cared not a whit whether the sneering, self-important young detective found her attractive. The most beautiful young woman he's ever met, my foot, Celine seethed to herself. Then she heaved a great sigh. Her temper could not get the better part of her today, as it nearly had last night. From the opposite side of the Mother Superior's desk, Michael Grimaldi observed her in studious silence before considering Pippa, who was seated between Celine and Arjun. Celine's palms turned clammy when Detective Grimaldi leveled an icy look at Arjun, who crossed an ankle over a knee before removing a small leather notebook and laying it on the desk alongside a graphite pencil. The immense wooden cross on the wall before Celine seemed to loom larger with each passing moment. Jesus himself appeared to lock his tortured gaze on hers and say, "I suffered like this for your salvation?" Celine looked away. It was important she keep her wits around her, that she not lose sight of Arjun's earlier directive. If she remained demure and silent, then perhaps Michael Grimaldi would leave them all alone. But if worst came to worst, Celine knew of a way to turn his attentions elsewhere. The location of a missing yellow hair ribbon, to be specific. Detective Grimaldi cleared his throat. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Miss Rousseau and Miss Montrose," he intoned. "Of course," Pippa murmured. "We wish to help in any way." Celine canted her head, caught her gaze, refrained from sharing her thoughts, though she was certain her expression spoke volumes. To Pippa's left, Arjun grinned, then produced a slender blade to begin sharpening the point of his graphite pencil. The snick, snick, snick of metal against wood was as comforting as it was infuriating. "Were you able to rest at all, Miss Rousseau?" Detective Grimaldi asked Celine directly. She inhaled through her nose. "It's kind of you to ask after me, Detective Grimaldi. I slept as well as can be expected." Placing his tweed fore and aft cap on the desk, the detective leaned back in his wooden chair. "Then I suppose you did not sleep well at all." "I'm not certain how to respond to that, sir. Are you making an indirect inquiry as to whether I slept as a guilty person would? If so, you must know it won't work." The snick of the knife against the pencil ceased mid-stroke. Michael Grimaldi arched a brow. "You share your thoughts quite candidly, Miss Rousseau." Celine considered baring her teeth in a fierce smile. The cursed wretch was deliberately trying to provoke her. Again, she smoothed her skirt, locking her attention on a faint green stain along its hem. "I suppose you'd prefer if I kept my thoughts to myself." "No. I appreciate your candor. I hope you continue sharing it with me." In response, Celine said nothing. Utterly unruffled, Detective Grimaldi turned to Pippa. "A good night's rest is something I value highly. As the first of 5 children, it was a luxury we could ill afford when I was a boy. How many siblings do you have, Miss Montrose? Pippa startled at his question. How do you know I have siblings? A simple deduction. The inner sleeve of your dress is worn through. The color is no longer fashionable, though it was made for a young woman not too long ago, suggesting it didn't belong to your mother. He peered at her intently. Stands to reason you're not an only child. Outrage caught in Celine's throat the instant Pippa's face flushed crimson. Celine opened her mouth to rebuke the detective, but caught herself, looking to Arjun for guidance. Their attorney finished sharpening his pencil. He rested his monocle atop his right eye and cracked open his small leather-bound notebook. Without a word, he started writing in it. The scratch of graphite to paper, the whole of his contribution to their inquiry. Infuriating man, Celine thought. The dress was given to me by my cousin, Pippa replied, her voice clear, guileless. And I'm also the eldest in my family. Of how many? Detective Grimaldi asked as if they were sipping afternoon tea at Claridge's. 3. I have a brother and a sister. He considered her for a moment. You must have been an excellent role model for them. Undoubtedly far better than I. Pippa looked away, swallowed. I did my best, Detective Grimaldi. You don't feel comfortable being candid in my presence, Miss Montrose? A furrow marred his forehead. It was unexpected of him to accuse Pippa of being disingenuous. I am being forthcoming, Pippa said. Would it help if I told you I don't harbor any suspicions toward you, Miss Montrose? Pippa took a careful breath. It would help, most definitely. She bit her lower lip. But that must mean you don't have suspicions about Celine either, since we were together the whole time. Arjun glanced up from his notebook. The detective inclined his head, his colorless eyes unblinking. Are you quite certain you were in Miss Russo's presence for the entire of the evening? Celine's heart thrashed about her chest like a caged bird. He'd trapped Pippa in a lie so easily. Pippa paled. She glanced at Arjun, who continued scribbling in his notebook, offering her not a single word of advice. There was a brief time in which I left her side, but it could not have been for more than 15 minutes. She finished in a hurry. During that time, Detective Grimaldi looked to Celine. Did you interact with anyone else, Miss Russo? Celine didn't even bother glancing toward Arjun for cues. It was clear Detective Grimaldi already knew the answers to the questions he was asking. He was trying to trip them, to muddy the waters. To what end, Celine could only hazard a guess. I believe you know that answer already, Celine said primly. Nevertheless, he waited for her response. With a small sigh, she continued. During that time, I shared a brief conversation with the owner of the establishment, Mr. Saint-Germain. Celine nodded. And was he present throughout the entirety of your visit to Jacques? Awareness flared through Celine hot and fast. Detective Grimaldi was after Bastien, not them. She should have realized it earlier, based on their mutual enmity from last night. Relief flooded through her like cool water on a parched day. Her mind whirled as it considered whether to disclose her observations about the yellow ribbon. But every word she spoke needed to be above reproach, and she lacked incontrovertible proof. No, Celine replied carefully. He was not. Arjun stopped writing, his pencil stealing above his notebook for an instant. Then he grinned to himself before resuming his scribblings. But that breath of time had revealed his hand. The truth of why the erstwhile attorney was here at all sharpened into sudden focus. He wasn't here to help them. He'd come to protect Bastien, to make sure his employer was not implicated in anything untoward. These blackguards had inserted themselves into Pippa and Celine's unfortunate situation to safeguard their own interests, proving they cared not a whit about anyone else. Even though Arjun had said as much to Celine, her anger rose in a sudden spike. The revelation about the yellow ribbon threatened to burst from her lips in a spate of uncontrolled fury. Lack of proof be damned! "Is something wrong, Miss Russo?" Detective Grimaldi asked. "Cursed him for being so observant." Celine cleared her thoughts with a toss of her dark curls. "Apart from the fact that I'm being questioned by the police, I can think of nothing that might be wrong." "I meant that you seemed piqued all of a sudden, as though something of note had captured your interest." "I only came to a troubling realization. That's all. May I inquire after it?" Pointedly, Celine slid her gaze to Arjun. He met her glare, then leaned back in his seat, the wood beneath him creaking at the shift in weight. The corners of his hazel eyes narrowed, his monocle glimmering as if in warning. "It is with respect to Monsieur Saint-Germain," Celine said. Michael Grimaldi did not move a muscle, his stillness belying his interest. "Though I only saw it for a moment," Celine began, "the image of Annabel in death will forever be seared onto my mind, and I wanted to be certain you'd caught every detail." The detective nodded. Arjun tapped the end of his pencil against the black leather of his notebook, a serene smile upon his face, though he kept his attention locked on Celine. Wordlessly, she dared him to stop her. Her pallid skin, Celine continued, her eyes frozen open in terror. Beside her, Pippa shuddered, her unbound hair across her face. She watched to see if Arjun had any reaction. Save for the continued tapping of his pencil against his notebook, he was devoid of all emotion. "And," Celine paused, "that horrible, jagged wound?" The detective waited. "A kind of wound that would have produced a great deal of blood, no doubt," Celine said. "It would be all but impossible for anyone present last night, including Monsieur Saint-Germain, to have committed such a heinous crime. Then drain their victim of blood and remove all traces from their person in time." Detective Grimaldi steepled his hands before him. He stared at Celine thoughtfully. She could not tell if he was impressed or irritated. "I came to a similar realization myself, Miss Russo," he said. "But precautions can be taken. Stained clothes can be changed. Coats and gloves can be doffed just as easily as they are donned." He bent over his joined hands. "To that end, did either you or Miss Montrose encounter anything you might deem suspicious?" Bastien had discarded his frock coat. Numerous members of Le Coeur de Lion had carried weapons on their persons. Knives, guns, ice picks, even rings that could double as instruments of torture and violence. Suddenly, the small red stain on the collar of Odette's shirt did not seem quite so innocuous. Odette, a murderess! Celine almost laughed to herself. Then her blood ran cold. Celine was a murderess. Anyone was capable of committing ghastly deeds, and everyone in the Court of the Lions appeared to possess otherworldly gifts. Some could taste the flavor of deceit, could make chess pieces move about bidden by the mind, could foretell the future with naught but a touch. Arjun himself had stilled a man into a stupor, simply by grabbing his wrist. Celine looked about, fear seeping into her soul. All these individuals were beyond the ordinary, their abilities extending far past parlor-room tricks. But to what extent? Again, she recalled what the two young women had revealed earlier in the square, about the court likely being responsible for the decapitated girl along the docks. The court. La Cour de Lion. Celine did not believe in coincidences, and only a fool would provoke creatures with untold appetites and unknown abilities. If Celine wished to keep herself safe, to keep Pippa safe, she needed to bend with the wind, no matter the bitter taste it would leave on her tongue. Suddenly she understood why the other officers of the New Orleans Metropolitan Police had granted Bastien such a wide berth. Cognez un nid de guêpe et vous serez piqué. Strike a wasp's nest, and you will be stung. Celine smoothed her apron over skirt. She met the detective's penetrating stare, refusing to flinch. "I'm sorry to say I saw nothing of note, Detective Grimaldi." Disappointment flashed across his face. He looked to Pippa. Surreptitiously, Celine reached under the table for Pippa's hand, squeezed it tightly. "I'm sorry, Detective Grimaldi," Pippa said in a clear voice, "but I didn't see anything either." "It's a shame my clients couldn't be of more help to you, Detective Grimaldi," Arjun said as he held open the door of the Mother Superior's office. To his credit, he did not look the least bit smug. Nevertheless, a hollow kind of rage spiraled through Celine's stomach. "It is indeed a great shame," Detective Grimaldi replied coolly. He moved back to let Pippa pass, then waited just beyond the oaken door. When Celine crossed the stone threshold into the cavernous corridor, the young detective shifted his tweed hat to his other hand to walk alongside her. He'd been waiting for Celine, perhaps for another chance to take her off guard. Before Detective Grimaldi could continue probing any further, Celine decided to wrest control of the situation and catch him unawares first. The quickest solution would be to needle the detective as he'd needled her. "It appears you know Monsieur Saint-Germain well," Celine said, expecting this to provoke him, based on the charged exchange between the two young men the evening prior. Michael Grimaldi surprised her. He did not seem perturbed in the slightest by her inquiry. "Yes, we were schoolmates as children, the best of friends." He offered this with a knowing expression, as though he were interested to see how this news affected her. Celine frowned. "Friends? Then why are you—" "I thought I was supposed to be the one with the questions." Celine bit down on the inside of her cheek while they walked. "My apologies for asking," she said, though she did not feel sorry at all. The suggestion of a smile touched his lips. "It might be odd for me to say this, but you would have made quite a detective yourself, Miss Russo." Celine snorted dismissively. While they followed Pippa and Arjun down the corridor toward the double doors leading outside, she recalled what Arjun had said earlier this afternoon about being the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of skin. Even you must be aware that those of the fairer sex could never strive for such a lofty position, Detective Grimaldi. "Alas, you are not wrong." The detective paused in contemplation. "Did you know the New Orleans Metropolitan Police is one of the only police forces in our country to allow men of color to serve in its ranks?" "I did not." Another spark of surprise warmed through Celine. "It's a rather recent development, most likely a twisted experiment of sorts." He sighed to himself. "But as a grandchild of a slave, I suppose it is a thing for which I should be grateful." A few steps ahead of them, Pippa and Arjun neared the massive double doors, Arjun reaching for a wooden handle to tug it open. He paused to glance Celine's way, and the ribbon of widening light to his left caused his eyes to flash silver for an instant, as though he were a predator crouched in the shadows. Inhuman. Unnerved by the recurring thought, Celine returned her attention to Michael Grimaldi, taking a moment to peruse his features. "When we first met, I thought you were Italian. Are you not?" "I am," The detective placed his hat beneath his arm and grasped hold of the other handle. "My father's family hails from Sicily, but my mother's family is of mixed blood, as are many longtime residents of New Orleans. Beyond the Garden District, that is." Detective Grimaldi moved aside to let Celine pass into the sunlight. "I see," Celine said slowly. Having the choice to conceal the truth of her own blended heritage meant she'd been spared this kind of cruel judgment. It shouldn't be revolutionary to think one's skin color should have no bearing on one's place in society. The detective held open the door while Celine emerged into the blinding brightness of the afternoon sun. "I agree," he said. "You may not be aware of this, but New Orleans society, indeed, society throughout the South, bases much of its notions on the one-drop rule." He followed in her footsteps. "If you possess a drop of African blood, you're granted little in the way of consideration." Celine pondered this, her vision straining to adjust to the harsh white light. She squinted up at him. "It's the land of the free, in idea only, then." A smirk took shape on his face. "My father's family were humble cobblers in Palermo. They often struggled to put two sticks together to start a fire. A chance for a better life brought them to Crescent City 50 years ago." He raised his right hand to shield his gaze from the sun. "What brought you to the shores of the New World, Miss Rousseau?" "The Mother Superior told me you arrived by ship less than a fortnight ago." Celine gripped the worn fabric of her skirts. "The same thing that brought your family here, Detective Grimaldi." She grinned into the light, her expression fierce. "Opportunity." The detective shifted, placing Celine in shadow, sheltering her from the worst of the sun's glare. "You're very good," he whispered. "Pardon?" "You're very good at hiding how smart you are, and you're very bad at trying to be charming." His lips twitched. "You don't find me charming?" "You're still interrogating me, Detective Grimaldi. Would you find yourself charming in this instance?" He swiped a large hand through his wavy hair. "Point taken. And please," he said, "call me Michael." "I don't know that that's appropriate." "I find such beliefs tedious. It's appropriate if we decide it can be. If only life were so simple. If only we all were smart enough to shun tedium as you do." His colorless eyes, so light a shade of blue as to appear almost white, shone oddly for an instant, almost as if he were amused. Nearby, Pippa coughed as if to clear her throat, and Celine pivoted toward her. Arjun and Pippa waited just outside the iron gate, their expressions incongruous. Pippa looked alert and studious, her eyes wide but not in a disapproving way. In contrast, Arjun appeared unconcerned with the happenings around him, save for the sharp light still glinting in his gaze. If Celine had to guess, the young lawyer looked cross. An idea took shape in her mind, a simple way to impress upon Arjun and his employer that she would do as she pleased, despite their attempts to interfere. Celine offered her right hand to Michael. "Have a good day, Detective Grimaldi. Please see that you do not return here any time soon." She sent him a teasing smile. He offered her an awkward, almost forced grin, then took her hand to press his lips to it. They were warm and soft. Despite intending to assert the advantage, Celine felt her cheeks start to redden. "Do I make you uncomfortable?" he asked without warning. "Not at all." His fingers tightened around hers. "You're lying." "What?" Celine blinked in dismay. Was she that bad at it? "It's of little consequence to me if you are. You see, the heart, Michael lifted her wrist where Celine's pulse pounded in her veins. "Doesn't lie." Without a word, she extricated her fingers, her cursed face inflaming further with every passing moment. Then she pivoted on a heel, intent on fleeing to the safety of the convent at once. "May I offer you a word of caution?" Michael asked, as she began retracing her steps. Celine turned back, waiting expectantly, knowing full well that Arjun was listening to their exchange, all with the intention of informing his employer. "It is with respect to Bastian," Michael said loudly, placing his tweed hat before him as if it were a shield. Celine said nothing in response, struggling to regain her composure. "When we were children, we called him the Ghost, because everyone around him seemed to perish without explanation, leaving behind nothing but specters." Michael began. "First his elder sister, Emily, then his mother, finally his father." He paused. "It didn't end there. When he turned 16, his uncle bribed a spot for him at West Point. Then one of Bastian's roommates was killed in a barroom fight. Bastian attacked another boy, blaming him for his friend's death. He beat the boy within an inch of his life. Not long after that, he was asked to leave the military academy in disgrace." "I think I understand what you mean," Celine said. "Thank you for the information," she said in a cold tone while Arjun bristled beyond the tines of wrought iron. "Bastian destroys everything he touches," Michael continued in a strident tone. "Unless it's something as soulless as money. Without money, he is indeed a dark prince. I appreciate the warning, but Monsieur Saint-Germain and I are unlikely to spend any time in each other's company, as I have no interest in having anything to do with him. I wish he shared the sentiment." Celine chose to ignore that comment. She glanced toward the gate, where Pippa gazed at her with an expression of undisguised curiosity. Arjun, meanwhile, shot daggers at Michael's back, then tilted his head at Celine in a spuriously light-hearted fashion. "I'd very much like to see you again, Celine," Michael announced, as if he had something to prove. Shocked to her core by this open admission, Celine nearly lost her footing. "This fool," she wondered, "believes I would afford him notice after he mocked me and harangued me about a murder for 2 days straight." Celine thought quickly, wondering what he hoped to achieve by making such a spectacle. It couldn't be as simple as annoying Bastian, could it? God save her from the pettiness of young men. Or perhaps... "I'd like that as well, Michael," Celine replied. "It would be smart to keep in Detective Grimaldi's good graces. Not to mention that it would irritate her traitor of an attorney immensely." Celine caught herself on the verge of grinning. Arjun had witnessed her chumming with Bastian's enemy. She'd bet anything the wily lawyer would be sure to add that particular detail to his collection of useless scribblings. Bully for him, Celine thought with dark light. How she wished she could see Bastian's face when Arjun informed him of today's developments. It served them right. The next time, they would know better than to use Celine Rousseau as a pawn.